Two friends found an abandoned cabin deep in the woods. Inside, they discovered documents that would unravel a conspiracy spanning 30 years. Eliza Hartwell stared at the eviction notice taped to her bakery door, the words blurring as tears threatened to spill. 30 days. That's all she had left before the landlord seized the space she'd poured 5 years of her life into. The small bakery on Maple Street had been her dream, her refuge after her divorce, the one thing that had kept her standing when everything else crumbled. She peeled the notice off and crumpled it in her fist, trying to ignore the curious stares from people passing on the sidewalk. Behind her, the oven sat cold. She couldn't afford to turn them on anymore. Couldn't afford the flour, the sugar, the electricity. The numbers in her bank account had dwindled to a number that made her stomach clench every time she checked, $312. Her best friend since high school, Dakota Monroe, found her sitting on the curb outside the bakery 20 minutes later. Dakota dropped down beside her without a word, their paint-stained overalls and messy bun a stark contrast to Eliza's flour-dusted apron and carefully braided hair. They'd been friends for 15 years, through every triumph and disaster, and Dakota could read Eliza's silence better than most people could read words. "How bad?" Dakota asked finally. 30 days, Eliza whispered. "Then it's gone." Dakota reached over and squeezed her hand. Their own art studio had closed 6 months ago when the building was sold to developers. Now Dakota survived on odd jobs and commission work that barely covered rent in their tiny apartment. Two women in their mid-30s, both watching their dreams dissolve like sugar in rain. They sat in silence as the autumn wind scattered leaves across the empty street. The town of Pinehaven had been slowly dying for years. Businesses closed, young people left, and those who remained seemed to accept the decay as inevitable. "There has to be something we can do," Dakota said, though their voice carried no conviction. That's when Eliza heard it. Two men talking outside the hardware store across the street. Their voices carried in the quiet afternoon, words drifting over like smoke. "Old Caldwell Place up in the Thornwood Forest. Been empty for decades. Nobody's touched it since the 80s. Probably rotted through by now. Vivian Blackwood's selling it though. Heard she just wants it gone. $200 and you can have the whole property." Eliza's head snapped up. $200 for a cabin. Even ruined, there might be salvage value. Old timber, vintage fixtures, maybe copper wiring. Things that city people paid premium prices for at antique markets. She caught Dakota's eye and saw the same desperate calculation happening there. After the men wandered off, Eliza pulled out her phone with shaking hands. Within minutes, she'd found the listing. The photo showed a small cabin barely visible through dense forest growth. The description was terse, remote forest property. Sold as is. No inspections. Cash only. Price, $200. "It's probably a waste," Dakota said, but Eliza could hear the hope underneath the doubt. "It's $200, Eliza replied. "We'll spend that much on rent this week anyway. What if there's something there? What if we can salvage enough to buy ourselves some time?" They looked at each other, two women with nothing left to lose and everything riding on a gamble that probably wouldn't pay off. But doing nothing meant certain failure. At least this way, they'd go down fighting. The next morning, they pulled what little money they had left and drove north in Dakota's battered pickup truck. The GPS took them as far as the old ranger station at the forest boundary, then gave up entirely. They'd arranged to meet Vivian Blackwood there. The woman who stepped out of a pristine Mercedes looked like she belonged in a corporate boardroom, not at the edge of a wilderness forest. She was in her late 60s, silver hair pulled back in a severe bun, wearing a tailored suit that probably cost more than Eliza made in a month. Her eyes were the color of creek water, cold and distant. But when Vivian looked at them, something flickered across her face. Relief, maybe. Or fear. It was gone too quickly to tell. "You're here for the cabin," Vivian said. Not a question. "Yes, ma'am," Eliza replied, pulling out an envelope with their pooled cash. Vivian took it without counting, which struck Eliza as strange. A woman who dressed like that, drove a car like that, should count every dollar. Instead, she produced a deed already filled out, signed it with a hand that trembled slightly, and handed it over along with a tarnished brass key. "You sure you want to do this?" Vivian asked, and for a moment her professional mask slipped. Underneath was something haunted, something that had been eating at her for a long time. "We're sure," Dakota said firmly. Vivian nodded slowly, then said something that would echo in Eliza's mind for days afterward. "Some secrets are too heavy to carry alone. Maybe you'll know what to do with them." Before either of them could ask what she meant, Vivian climbed into her Mercedes and drove away, leaving them standing in a cloud of dust with a deed to a property they'd never seen and a warning they didn't understand. The hike into Thornwood Forest took nearly 3 hours. The trail had been reclaimed by nature years ago, leaving them to navigate by compass and an old topographic map Vivian had included with the deed. Eliza carried a backpack full of supplies, water, and a first aid kit. Dakota had their toolbox and a high-powered flashlight. Dakota's rescue dog, Luna, had come along. The black Labrador mix had been Dakota's constant companion for 4 years, ever since they'd found her abandoned at a rest stop. Luna was usually fearless, eager to explore, tail always wagging. But as they pushed deeper into the forest, Luna's behavior changed dramatically. The dog stopped in her tracks, ears pinned back, body going rigid. A low whine escaped her throat, the kind of sound Eliza had never heard Luna make before. It was fear, pure and instinctive. "Luna, come on girl," Dakota coaxed, but the dog refused to move forward. She planted her paws and pulled backward on the leash, desperate to retreat. "She's never like this," Dakota said, worry creeping into their voice. "Not even during thunderstorms. What's wrong with her?" They finally emerged into a small clearing, and Eliza understood Luna's reluctance. The cabin sat at the center like a wound in the forest. It was larger than the photos suggested, a 2-story structure with a sagging porch and windows that looked like empty eye sockets. The roof had caved in on the right side, and vegetation had begun to reclaim the walls, but the foundation looked solid. Too solid for a building that had supposedly been abandoned for 40 years. There was something deliberate about the place. It didn't feel abandoned. It felt like it had been waiting. "This is it?" Dakota asked, their voice small in the vast silence of the forest. Eliza approached the front door, her heart pounding. Luna refused to come within 20 feet of the cabin, whining and pulling against her leash until Dakota had to tie her to a tree. "I've never seen her act like this," Dakota repeated, stroking Luna's head. "Never." Eliza fit the brass key into the lock. It resisted, corroded by decades of moisture and neglect, then suddenly gave with a click that seemed too loud in the stillness. The door swung inward with a groan of rusty hinges. The smell hit them first. Not the expected odor of rot and mildew, but something metallic and sharp, like old blood or rust mixed with something chemical. The air inside felt wrong, heavier than it should be, pressing against their skin like a physical weight. Eliza raised her flashlight. The beam cut through thick darkness, illuminating a large room that should have been empty but wasn't. The walls were covered in paper. Hundreds of documents, photographs, maps, all pinned and taped in overlapping layers that extended from floor to ceiling. It looked like the workspace of someone obsessed, someone who had spent years building a case that no one would ever see. Dakota stepped inside, their own flashlight sweeping across the chaos. "What is all this?" Eliza moved closer to the nearest wall, her breath catching as she began to understand what she was looking at. They were property maps. Dozens of them, all showing the same region, the valleys and ridges surrounding Pine Haven. And scattered across each map were red X marks, like targets or graves. Beside each X was a name, a date, and coordinates written in cramped, frantic handwriting. Hartwell Farm, March 1989. Monroe Homestead, July 1992. Chin Family Property, November 1995. Vasquez Ranch, April 1998. Eliza's blood went cold. She reached out and touched the first entry with trembling fingers. Hartwell Farm, March 1989. Dakota, she whispered. "This is my grandmother's farm. The one my family lost when I was a kid." Dakota came to her side, their face pale in the flashlight beam. They stared at the second entry, their own family name staring back at them. "My parents' homestead," Dakota said, their voice hollow. "They lost it when I was 8 years old. I remember my mom crying for weeks. My dad never talked about what happened. He just broke." They moved along the walls, finding more names. Some they recognized from Pinehaven, families who had left town suddenly or fallen into poverty. Others were unfamiliar, but the pattern was impossible to miss. Properties lost, families displaced, lives destroyed. All marked with red X's like casualties in a war. And at the center of every transaction, appearing again and again in the margins and notes, was one name, Blackwood Development Corporation. "Vivian Blackwood," Eliza said, the pieces falling into place. "She didn't just sell us this cabin. She's connected to all of this." They searched more carefully, finding boxes stacked in corners, filing cabinets against the back wall. Dakota forced open the first cabinet and found it stuffed with documents. Property deeds, transfer agreements, letters on corporate letterhead. All showing the same pattern, families selling valuable land for fractions of its worth. Some signatures looked clean, deliberate. Others were shaky, hesitant, written by hands that had been forced. Eliza opened another box and found photographs. Her stomach turned as she flipped through them. Burned homes. Wells with dead livestock around them. Landslides that had buried roads and cut off access to properties. Industrial equipment sitting abandoned on family land. "This wasn't bad luck," Dakota said, holding up a letter written on official county letterhead. "This was systematic. Look at this." The letter was dated August 1994, written by someone named Margaret Torres, a county environmental inspector. "I can no longer participate in falsifying contamination reports. What Vivian Blackwood and her development company are doing to these families is criminal. They're poisoning wells, starting fires, and manipulating safety inspections to force people off their land. But she has connections at the state level, and no one will listen to me. I'm documenting everything here because someone needs to know the truth. Someone needs to stop her." The letter ended there. Dakota flipped it over and found a newspaper clipping taped to the back. "Margaret Torres, County Environmental Inspector, killed in single-car accident on Highway 12. August 1994. She died 2 weeks after writing that letter." Eliza felt sick. She pulled out another deed and recognized the signature at the bottom. The handwriting was shaky, barely legible, written by someone whose hand had been trembling. "Hartwell, Sarah, March 1989. Her grandmother. She'd signed away their family farm for $8,000, a tenth of what it was worth." Eliza remembered that time vaguely, remembered her parents' hushed arguments, remembered her grandmother's silence. The old woman had died a year later, and no one ever spoke about the farm again. "They didn't just take property," Eliza said, her voice breaking. "They destroyed families. They murdered people who tried to stop them." Dakota was reading through more documents, their hands shaking. "There are at least 30 families here. Maybe more. All forced out between 1985 and 2005. And Vivian Blackwood orchestrated all of it." They sat in the dusty cabin, surrounded by decades of carefully documented crimes, and finally understood what Vivian had meant. Some secrets are too heavy to carry alone. She hadn't sold them a cabin. She'd sold them evidence. Evidence of conspiracy, fraud, possibly murder. She'd carried this guilt for years, and now she wanted someone else to bear the weight. "We need to take this to the police," Eliza said. "All of it. Every document, every photo." Dakota nodded, already pulling out their phone. But the screen showed no signal. They were too deep in the forest. "We'll have to carry what we can," Dakota said, dumping tools out of their backpack to make room for documents. They worked quickly, filling both backpacks with the most damning evidence. Deeds with forged signatures, photos of sabotage, letters from victims who had tried to fight back. The metal box full of transaction records. The maps showing the full scope of the conspiracy. Eliza was reaching for another file when she heard it. The sound of engines. Multiple vehicles, coming through the forest. Then voices, muffled by distance but growing closer. Luna barked outside, a sharp warning that made Eliza's blood run cold. Dakota killed their flashlight. Eliza did the same, plunging them into darkness. They crouched behind a filing cabinet as shadows moved past the broken windows. Footsteps crunched through leaves and undergrowth, circling the cabin. Then a voice, clear and authoritative, cut through the silence. "Check inside. If they found anything, we need to know." The door handle rattled. Eliza's heart hammered so hard she thought it might give them away. She could feel Dakota beside her, barely breathing, their hand gripping hers in the darkness. The door creaked open, and light from a flashlight swept across the room. Multiple sets of footsteps entered the cabin. "Someone's been here recently," a man's voice said. "Dust is disturbed. Files are missing." "Find them," another voice commanded. This one was familiar, cultured, authoritative. Vivian Blackwood's voice. "Find them before they leave this forest." Eliza realized with cold certainty that Vivian hadn't given them evidence out of guilt. She'd given them bait. And now they were trapped in a cabin full of secrets, surrounded by people who had killed to protect those secrets before and wouldn't hesitate to do it again. Through a gap in the wall, Eliza could see Luna still tied to the tree, barking frantically. The dog knew they were in danger. And outside, more footsteps were coming. Eliza held her breath as flashlight beams swept across the cabin's interior. Through a crack in the filing cabinet, she could see 3 figures moving through the room. 2 were men in dark clothing, built like security guards. The third was Vivian Blackwood, her silver hair catching the light, her face harder than marble. "They couldn't have gotten far," Vivian said, her cultured voice tight with urgency. "The trail is blocked on the south side. Patterson, check upstairs. Reeves, search the perimeter." The men moved with military precision. One headed for the stairs while the other stepped back outside. Eliza could hear Luna barking frantically, then a yelp as someone kicked the dog. Dakota tensed beside her, rage flickering in their eyes. Eliza squeezed their hand hard. "Not yet," she mouthed. Vivian stood alone in the center of the room, surveying the disturbed documents with an expression that might have been regret if not for the cold calculation in her eyes. She pulled out her phone and made a call. "They found it." "Yes, all of it. We need to contain this now." A pause. "I don't care what it costs." "No witnesses." "None." She ended the call and walked slowly along the walls, running her fingers over the maps as if saying goodbye. 30 years of work, she whispered to herself. It shouldn't end like this. Upstairs, footsteps creaked across old floorboards. Outside, Reeves was circling the cabin, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Eliza's mind raced. They had 2 backpacks full of evidence, but they were trapped. The moment they moved, they'd be seen. Then Dakota did something that made Eliza's heart stop. They grabbed a metal file box and hurled it through the back window. Glass exploded. Vivian spun toward the sound. "Back window," she shouted. Both men converged on the rear of the cabin. In that moment of distraction, Dakota grabbed Eliza's arm and pulled her toward the front door. They moved fast and low, backpacks clutched to their chests. Luna's barking covered the sound of their footsteps. They made it to the porch before Reeves shouted, "They're running." Dakota cut Luna free with their pocket knife. The 3 of them plunged into the forest as flashlight beams swept toward them. Eliza heard the crack of a gunshot, felt bark explode from a tree inches from her head. They ran blindly through darkness, branches whipping their faces, roots trying to trip them. Luna led the way, her dark shape barely visible. Behind them, voices shouted coordinates and directions. More engines roared to life. "They've got ATVs," Dakota gasped. "We can't outrun them." Eliza's lungs burned. Her legs screamed. But she kept running, the backpack of evidence weighing her down like guilt, like hope, like the last chance 30 families would ever have for justice. They burst through a thicket and nearly fell into a ravine. The ground dropped away sharply, a stream cutting through rocks 20 feet below. Luna skidded to a stop at the edge. "We have to cross," Eliza said, already looking for a way down. They scrambled down the steep slope, using roots and rocks for handholds. Eliza slipped halfway down, sliding the last 10 feet and landing hard in the shallow stream. Cold water soaked through her clothes. Dakota landed beside her, pulling her up. Behind them, flashlight beams reached the ravine's edge. "Down there. Move!" They splashed through the stream, Luna bounding ahead. The forest on the other side was denser, older growth that blocked out even the moonlight. Eliza could barely see 5 feet ahead, but they kept moving, driven by fear and adrenaline. Then Dakota grabbed her arm, pulling her behind a massive fallen tree. They crouched there, gasping for breath, as footsteps and voices grew closer. Luna pressed against them, silent now, her body vibrating with tension. 3 flashlight beams converged on the stream. Eliza recognized Vivian's voice among them. "They can't have gone far. Spread out. Check every shadow." The lights moved slowly along the ravine, searching methodically. One beam swept dangerously close to their hiding spot. Eliza pressed herself against the rotting wood, praying the darkness would hold. "Found something," one of the men called out. He was holding up a piece of torn fabric, probably from Dakota's jacket. "Fresh." They went this way. The lights moved east, away from them. Eliza waited until the voices faded before daring to breathe. "We need to get to a road," she whispered. "Get to town where there are witnesses." Dakota pulled out their compass, the small glow barely visible. "Highway 17 should be north. Maybe 2 miles. They moved carefully now, trying to balance speed with stealth. Luna ranged ahead, her dark shape sometimes disappearing entirely in the shadows. Every snapping branch made Eliza's heart jump. Every distant sound could be pursuers closing in. After what felt like hours but was probably only 40 minutes, they saw light through the trees. Not flashlights, but steady illumination. The highway. They emerged from the forest onto the shoulder of Highway 17 just as an 18-wheeler roared past, its wind blast nearly knocking them over. In the glow of its taillights, Eliza saw Dakota's face, scratched and bleeding, eyes wide with exhaustion and relief. A car's headlights appeared in the distance. Dakota stepped into the road, waving their arms. The car, an older sedan driven by a woman in her 60s, screeched to a stop. "Please," Eliza gasped, running to the driver's window. "We need help. People are trying to kill us. We need to get to the police." The woman's eyes widened as she took in their appearance, torn clothes, wild eyes, the dog covered in burrs. But something in Eliza's voice must have convinced her because she unlocked the doors. "Get in. Pine Haven Police Station is 10 minutes from here." They climbed into the back seat, Luna squeezing between them. As the car accelerated away, Eliza looked back and saw flashlight beams emerging from the forest. Too late. They were on public roads now, in a witness's car, with evidence that could bring down an empire. The Pine Haven Police Station was a small brick building that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1980s. Sheriff Thomas Brennan was in his late 50s, gray-haired and skeptical. But as Eliza and Dakota spread documents across his desk, his expression changed from doubt to shock to cold fury. "Vivian Blackwood did this," he said, reading Margaret Torres's letter for the 3rd time. "She's on the town council. She funds the library, the community center. With money she stole from 30 families," Dakota said flatly. "It's all here. Forged documents, sabotage, possibly murder." Brennan picked up the photo of Eliza's grandmother's burned farm. "Sarah Hartwell. I remember this. They said it was an electrical fire." "It wasn't," Eliza said quietly. "None of them were accidents." The sheriff was silent for a long moment, then reached for his phone. I'm calling the state police. This is beyond us. Within an hour, the small station was filled with state troopers and investigators. They photographed every document, took statements, sent teams to secure the cabin before Vivian could destroy more evidence. By dawn, arrest warrants had been issued. Vivian Blackwood was taken into custody at her home, along with 3 associates. The local news picked up the story by noon. By evening, it had gone statewide. Eliza and Dakota sat in the sheriff's office, drinking terrible coffee and watching the news on a small TV. The anchor was calling it one of the largest property fraud conspiracies in state history. 30 families, Dakota said softly. 30 families will finally know the truth. Eliza thought of her grandmother, of the shame that had followed the old woman to her grave. Of all the people who had carried guilt that wasn't theirs to carry. It's not over, she said. Vivian has lawyers. This could take years. But it started, Dakota replied. That's something. Sheriff Brennan entered with papers in his hand. You'll need to testify when this goes to trial. Both of you. It won't be easy. Blackwood's people will come after your credibility, your character, everything. We know, Eliza said. She felt the weight of what was coming, but it felt lighter than the weight of doing nothing. Outside, Luna barked at a squirrel, tail wagging, already forgetting the terror of the night before. Sometimes Eliza envied the dog's ability to live in the moment, unburdened by past or future. A week later, Eliza reopened her bakery. The local paper had run a feature on the women who exposed Blackwood, and suddenly customers were lining up around the block. People wanted to support them, to be part of something good rising from something terrible. Dakota's phone was ringing constantly with commission requests. Apparently courage sold well in a town that had forgotten what it looked like. They knew it wouldn't last. The media attention would fade. The trial would be long and painful. Some people in town, those connected to Vivian or benefiting from her money, already saw them as troublemakers rather than heroes. But standing in her bakery, watching Dakota paint a mural on the wall showing a forest breaking into light, Eliza felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. 2 friends had found a cabin in the woods. Inside, they'd discovered not just evidence of crimes, but proof that truth, however buried, eventually finds its way to light. That silence protects the guilty, but speaking out protects everyone else. The cabin still stood in Thornwood Forest, now surrounded by police tape and investigators. But its secrets were no longer hidden. Its weight no longer crushed the innocent. And for 30 families, justice had finally begun.